Good morning, everybody. Okay, let's get started. We were learning on Friday that that it is permitted to steal if it's in order to save a life. Okay, so but the only thing that we said was that you have to have it with the intent. You have to have the intent of eventually paying back the person that you stole from. And even if you don't have the money now, your objective has to be eventually, I will pay back. The justification for stealing, of course, is that I need to save a life. That's where we were. That's where we were holding last time. And the Biurim over here just points out an interesting discussion that's held in some of the Sfarim. He says, Ayin Imrei Yaakov, the Yesh Omrim, De'im lo yihiyeh lo malo shalem nam misharei, de'in davar ha'omed bifnei pikuach nefesh. This is the last thing that we saw on Friday, I believe, that even if you know that you'll never be able to pay it back because what you've stolen is like a huge amount of money, it's like $1 million vaccine, and in all likelihood, you'll never be able to pay that amount back. You're still allowed to steal it because there is nothing that stands in the way of pikuach nefesh. It's an interesting question, an interesting ethical question that I'd like just to raise as an aside. To what degree can a person be dishonest in working their way towards getting a vaccine for COVID? In other words, people talk about the breach of ethics and jumping the line, right? So what if a person were to argue, I'm a high-risk person, and it's a matter of pikuach nefesh. It's a matter of saving my life because I've managed to escape the virus until now, but every day is a new risk. It's a risk of pikuach nefesh. So can I justify doing something dishonest in order to get the vaccine? It's not an easy question to answer, and that's why I hesitate. And I think it requires a lot of deliberation because on the one hand, you have to be concerned about a Chilul Hashem. I got an email that I actually did not respond to, but the email was from a Jewish person who told me that at Mackenzie Health, they saw a whole line of religious-looking Jews lining up to get the vaccine who clearly were much younger than the 80 years old. They were jumping the line and getting some kind of backdoor way of getting in. I have no way of knowing what the situation was, and this person was very irate that this was creating a Chilul Hashem. So on the one hand, I am very sympathetic with that line of argument, but on the other hand, if one can argue that this is pikuach nefesh, so then if you're allowed to steal for pikuach nefesh, what about jumping the line for pikuach nefesh? I don't have a clear answer, especially because there is also jumping the line also means that there may be less vaccines for people who need them more than I do. Does that play a role? This is a very, very complicated issue, and I hope it's just a very temporary thing that will be resolved very soon. But regarding this abstract issue of that it is permissible to steal in order to save a life, he says, V'lichora hayanira lechalek beinin hu notel ad chamishis mamano shel chavero uvein im notel yoser mizeh. So the Rav Stern writes that it would seem to me that one might need to make a distinction between, in looking at how much of the person's money you're stealing. What if you wipe out another person by taking all of their assets in order to save a life? You need a car, right? And so you take your friend's car, which is the net sum total of everything he owns, because otherwise he has nothing else to his name, and you steal his car and you crash his car in order to save a life. I don't know, just create some kind of crazy idea. So it could be that maybe you only have a right to steal up to a fifth of a person's assets, but you're not allowed to steal more than a fifth, more than 20%. Now, based on what? So he says that ad chomesh nechasav kaimelon ba'orachayim simin tafresh nun vav the chayiv lahotzi al mitzvah overes. He says because we know that the Shulchan Aruch paskins in Orachayim that a person should spend up to 1/5 of their total assets in order to fulfill a mitzvah. So, for example, if when contemplating whether I should buy a lulav in esrog, right? I'm not allowed to spend more than 20% of my net worth in order to fulfill any mitzvah, whether it's matzah or lulav and esrog and so forth. If it costs such an exorbitant sum, then even though I'll be forsaking a mitzvah, I'm not obligated anymore in that mitzvah. Masha'ein kein biyoser mizeh. By the way, I'll just bring up that sif in Shulchan Aruch. Let me just bring that up 1 second. Orachayim Taf Reish.
Rabbi?
Yes.
While you're looking it up, there's the concept of a poor man is considered like a dead person.
Yes.
So if you steal all his assets to save another life, aren't you theoretically?
Are you theoretically killing him? Yeah. Well, the problem with that, Shmuel, is that statement that a poor man is considered like a dead man is not a halachic pronouncement; it's a midrashic pronouncement. And it's sometimes you can't mix and match. We know that like the story of Yaakov Avinu when he was fleeing from Esav, Esav's grandson, Esav's son rather, Eliphaz, ran after Esav, and he was about to kill him. And Yaakov said, "Don't kill me. Let me give you all my money, and that way at least you can tell your father you fulfilled his commandment." Now, if one was going to, and so Yaakov gave Eliphaz everything he owned, and the Medrash says that because of the principle that an ani is chashuv kameis, that a poor person is considered like a dead person, so Eliphaz was still fulfilling his father's commandment. Okay, right? So that's the source for that idea. So the question is, excuse me, if we were going to analyze that from a strictly halachic lens, the story makes really no sense. Because if your father tells you to kill someone, are you obligated to listen to your father according to halacha? No, of course not, because we have a principle of divrei harav, divrei hatalmud, divrei mishomim, that if a human being tells you to do something and God tells you to do the exact opposite, you always listen to God and you don't listen to a human being. I'm not obligated to honor my father's wishes if he tells me to commit murder, right? So, this is an allegory. It's a medrash, and you can't necessarily apply it through the criterion of a halachic prism. Okay, I hope I'm answering your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, sure. So what the Imrei Yaakov is referring to is the statement of the Ramah, and the Ramah states as follows: "Umi she'ein lo esrog." Can everyone see that, or is the print too small? I'm wondering if I should make it a little bit bigger. Display.
No, you're not displaying the right screen either.
Oh, sorry. Okay, can everyone see it now? Okay, you got it? Okay, so the Ramah says, Umi she'ein lo esrog, o sha'ar mitzvah oferes, that we're talking about the laws of esrog, and you have to try and find a good esrog. If a person doesn't have an esrog or any other mitzvah, which is time related, such that you only have a certain window in which you can fulfill this mitzvah. Ein sarich levazvez aleha hon rav. You're not obligated to expend a huge fortune. Uchemosha amru, and as our sages tell us, hamevazvez al yevazvez yoter mechomesh, that when you spend money, you don't have to spend more than 20% of your net value, of your net worth. Afilu mitzvah overet, even if it's a passing mitzvah, which means that you only have a window in which to fulfill it because it's a time-bound mitzvah. V'davka mitzvahs aseh, but that's only when it comes to a positive commandment that you are not obligated to spend more than a fifth of your net worth. Avolosase yitain kol mamono kodem sheyavor. But when it comes to a negative commandment, you have to give all of your money to avoid violating that mitzvah. So, for example, if a person, the Torah says, do not eat pig, and in order for you to avoid eating pig, or I'm not sure if that's a good example or not. Let's see. I'm just trying to see if the Mishnah Berurah says, let's say, to avoid being Mechalel Shabbos, for example, you would have to spend all of your net worth in order to avoid being Mechalel Shabbos. And like the Mishnah Berurah says, the Afti Yitztarech al Yidei Ze'acher Kach Lachzor Al Psachim, even if a person, right, this was the challenge in the early 20th century where people would get fired if they took off for Shabbos, right? So he says, even if a person has to go from door to door collecting tzedakah, lo nuchal lahater al yidei zeh isurei Torah. We still cannot permit a person, there's no justification for a person to violate the Torah. In a mitzvahs lo saseh situation, right? When you're going to violate a thou shalt not. V'zeh afilu below saseh grade, v'kol shkenim nogea hadavar l'chai v'krisus chas v'shalom. And this applies to even minor negative commandments. And it certainly applies to a negative commandment which has an isser of kares attached to it. He says, for example, if a person cannot find a particular source of income unless he agrees to work on the Sabbath and to do work like other workers, asr lo lishma lahem, he's not allowed to. And even though this will have dire ramifications for yourself and the members of your household, everyone's going to go hungry. You cannot cut off your soul. In other words, you cannot incur a kares penalty in order to put food on the table. So on the one hand, to fulfill a positive commandment, you should spend only up to 20% of your income. And this was a very common issue in Europe before the 20th century in getting a lulav and esrog, because sometimes the cost to import a lulav and esrog from Turkey or wherever it was would be a small fortune. To get, in Poland, to bring a lulav and esrog. There's no palm trees in Poland. Where you're going to get a lulav, where you're going to get a citrus esrog. There were no esrog trees in Poland. I can guarantee it, because the climate is not conducive to it. So where are you going to get these? So usually what would happen is that one person in the shtetl would buy a lulav and esrog, and he would share it with everybody else, right? I told that story the first Shabbos that I was here. I told that story of the man who he was in a shtetl and the rabbi passed away, and they needed a new rabbi, and he was a Talmud Chacham, so the people were asking him, be our rabbi, and he kept turning them down, and his wife was after him. She says, why not take the job? They'll give you a salary. Be the rabbi. He says, you know what? Finally, he says, I'll agree to be the rabbi on one condition, that this year you buy the lulav and esrog for the shtetl. And it was a lot of money. So she finally agrees, and she takes out her kneppel, which is like her little stash that she's been saving for the last 20 years. and she goes ahead and she spends a small fortune to buy the lulav and esrog. And so over the course of the Chag, everyone in the shtetl is coming to hold the lulav, the esrog, to shake lulav and esrog, and to fulfill the mitzvah. And as you can imagine, when you have hundreds of people over the course of 7 days shaking the lulav and the esrog, so the lulav gets a little bent, and the esrog starts to get a little soft, and maybe turns a little brown from all of the fingerprints and everything. So at the end, after Simchas Torah, he turns to his wife and he shows her the esrog that was originally beautiful and yellow and shiny and really beautiful. The light bouncing off of it is now this soft little mushy brown esrog. He says, if this is what you'd like me to look like in 5 years, I'll take the job. That's the old joke about the esrog. But in any event, that joke only works if you appreciate that there was only one esrog typically in the entire shtetl, because it was a huge amount of money, and that's why the Shulchan Aruch discusses this issue by the laws of the Arba Minim, of purchasing an esrog. So, on the one hand, for a mitzvahs aseh, for a positive commandment, you're not obligated. You're considered to be an oines, and that you cannot fulfill the mitzvah if it's going to cost more than 20% of your net worth. And let me just see if there's a Mishnah Berurah over here. Let's see. So the Mishnah Berurah does say that he says if you had a very good year, you would have to spend 10% of your income from that year for that mitzvah. He says, the gam bitzdaka shiur beinoni whom may eser. And he says, because even for tzedakah, you have to give 10%. V'ayin b'magin, he says, basically, this is a comparable type of situation. And he says, V'ayin b'magin Avram ve'el Yerabah, de kamo sham le'inyan tzedakah shana rishona min ha'keren, mikan va'elach min ha'revach, hachanami b'inyanenu. He says, but that's only what you made from this year. You'd have to spend up to 10% for an esrog. V'ayin b'bir halacha shebiraynu derotzelomer demishir zeh bevadai aser lefachos aval efsher de b'inyanenu dehu mitzvah veris garat fei v'chayv lahutzi ad chomesh min hachasav. It could be, says the Mishnah Berurah, that when you have a mitzvah like this, which can only be fulfilled within a certain window of time, you might have to spend up to a fifth of your entire net worth. Okay. All right. But this is the basis of the mitzvah that Rav Stern is talking about. And so basically the argument that he wants to make is that saving a life is a positive mitzvah. So he says, Masha Enkin biyoser mizeh. He says, you're not obligated to spend more than a fifth. He says, V'hacha le'inyan hatzalas nefashos, af da'over b'lav d'lasamad al damreyecha. He says, now you might argue that there is a mitzvahs lo saseh at stake here as well. Not just the positive mitzvah of saving a life, but there's a negative commandment. Do not stand idly by your brother's blood. And since that's phrased as a thou shalt not, perhaps I have to spend my entire fortune or someone else's entire fortune in order to save a life. Mikol makom kevin shuhu lav she'ein bo ma'isa dino ka'aseh ve'eino mechuyev levazvez kol mamono. He says, but one could argue that since it's a passive thou shalt not, it's not an active thou shalt not, then a passive thou shalt not is tantamount to an active thou shalt. That's his argument. He says that the only time that you have to give up your entire all of your assets, your entire estate, is if you have to actively commit a negative offense, like violating Shabbos or eating chazer, right? Or like violating Shabbos by working on Shabbos. But what if the commission of the thou shalt not, the mitzvahs lo saseh, is by being passive and doing nothing, like not saving a life, then maybe it has the same status of a positive commandment where you're not obligated to give more than 20%. He says, Amnam davar zeh eino barer kol kach. He says, it's not so clear. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. V'im kain, hoil v'chavero eino chayv lahotzi kol mamono kedei lahatzilo. And he says, based on that, since my friend, who I'm stealing from in order to, let's say, save a family member's life or my own life, if the guy I'm stealing from would not be obligated to spend more than 20% of his assets in order to save my life, in kain memela gam hu eino rashai lagazol, so I don't have permission to steal from him either, more than 20% of his assets. Avsha osa lahatzil nafsho, even if I'm doing it to save a life. So he writes that the Maharsham, who I'm not sure whether it's 17th or 18th century, he says he deals with this issue. Uviksuvas Yutes Amid Aleph Amru Ilu Asu Lekaman La Amluche Amrinan Lahu Zilu Chasuma Velotis Katolon. The Gemara in Maseches Ksuvos is talking about witnesses who admit that they were forced to sign on a document against their will. And they nevertheless, they said, yes, it's our signature. We were forced to sign, but this is actually what happened. And the question is, are they trustworthy or not to testify? Have they, in a sense, disqualified themselves, tainted themselves by admitting that they signed falsely on a document? So the Gemara says that no, they don't disqualify themselves, because if someone put a gun to their head and told them to sign, they would have an obligation to sign that paper. He says, because as we learn, the Gemara says, there are only 3 cardinal sins for which you give up your life. And signing falsely on a document is not one of the 3 cardinal sins. So if someone puts a gun to your head and says, sign this or die, you have to sign. And there, no distinction was made between whether there was a large amount of money or a small amount of money that they are sacrificing. In other words, they're going to sign off that so-and-so owes money to Vinny, okay? And by signing off that so-and-so owes money to Vinny, they're causing the guy that they're testifying about to potentially lose his entire fortune. So it seems from that Gemara that if you need to do this in order to save your life by causing a person to get completely wiped out, you're allowed to do it. He says, and don't try to tell me that it's different over there, because by signing the paper, you're not doing an active stealing. It's only causative. He says that's not the case. The Gemara seems to say that even though by signing the paper, if that were to be taken to court, you would cause a person to be completely wiped out of their entire fortune, you would still be justified in signing the paper because you're saving a life thereby. It seems that from that Gemara, at least, that you could justify stealing or some act which will cause complete financial ruination for another person in order to save a life. But it's not so clear. And again, this is the 2 sides of the coin are that on the one hand, perhaps I'm not obligated to, or I'm not permitted to steal more than 20% of someone's total assets, because he himself would not be obligated to do that in order to save my life. So maybe I'm not allowed to steal from him more than that. On the other hand, it seems like if my death is imminent because someone's threatened to kill me, then I am allowed to sign a document that will cause someone else's complete financial wipeout. So it's an ambiguous issue, and hopefully a person would never find himself in that kind of predicament. Okay? And this is where I'm going to hold it for today, because I have to get ready for my next share. So let me wish you all a good day. We'll continue this discussion, Mir Hashem, tomorrow. Don't forget to join the Prabhas today, everybody. I hope you've been following the email. To please take some time today and tonight to meet our new rabbinic